spoke, the first one that spoke, said, I speak for a generation of children who've been deprived of the capacity to have an imagination. This has been an experiment on children. And it's an experiment. You may say there's no evidence, but if some people say it's helpful, why shouldn't they have it? But it's been an experiment, and it's an experiment that's failed. And I'm trying to do all I can to prevent there being a puberty blockers trial. And that is just another experiment giving children medication which we know is harmful.
And medical treatments are based on your medical condition. They're not based on your identity. It's not diabetic phobic that I can't get insulin because I'm not diabetic.
That within the general population, broadly speaking, between 2 and 3% of people are probably lesbian, gay, or bisexual. This is how many of the young people at GIDS were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And we can break it down a bit more. So 89% of the girls were lesbian or bi. And of the boys, 81% were gay or bi.
So I'm very pleased indeed I'm honoured to be there at this meeting. I thought I might start with a tiny vignette. The GIDS service, they've said in a number of places that the number of people who were dissatisfied was less than 1%. But that's purely based on people who came back. The large number of people, detransitioners, didn't go back. In fact, it was very hard to get them out of their rooms to see any doctors at all. And certainly they didn't go back to the Diagnostic. So the number is much bigger, and I've met quite a few of them. These are women mainly that I've talked to. I've talked to that many men, but who felt terribly let down by the whole service. And one of them said to me, when I was about 10, my body started to change. I hated it. Now, a lot of girls do this, not uncommon. Not all girls, but it's not uncommon. I hated it. And then she said, she talked more about it, but I won't go into the details. But she said when she went to GIDS and they said to her she was transgender and that she would transition, she would start on puberty blockers, possibly on opposite sex hormones. She said, do you know what I heard? I heard they were agreeing with me that my body was disgusting and that having a feminine body was disgusting. I said, what? I say that, you see, because we must remember the Tavistock, part of its fame is psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis and cultural and social theory, group psychology and child psychotherapy and so on. And it is extraordinary how a service based within the Tavistock completely ignored sexuality. The always stock in trade of thinking with young people and adults about our ordinary hidden desires and so on completely didn't exist. So they just existed in a very peculiar place in relation to the Tavistock. I retired from the Tavistock in 2021, and in 2018 I was a governor. So a governor, I don't know if you know, that's a kind of parallel service and the various stakeholders, and I was representing the staff, the academic and clinical staff. And I must say I was already extremely uneasy about the GIDS service because it was very difficult to find out what went on. There were no presentations. I was chair of the scientific life for the Tavistock at the time. And we had a presentation, but there wasn't a single case mentioned. So it was very hard to find out, and there was an unease. And I think I felt a bit like a child in a family where you know there's something wrong, but you also know you're not supposed to speak about it. But that all changed when people knocked on my door. All with very, very similar concerns, very serious concerns. Some soon after left the service. A significant number of these staff were gay and lesbian people who had felt that their concerns about these children weren't listened to. In fact, one was referred to as an angry gay person and taken off the case. he was worried that the child was really confused about his sexuality. We do know that a lot of these children, if managed in a different way, will emerge as gender non-conforming gay and lesbian people. But we'll hear more of that later. So the concerns that they raised, first of all, a lot of the staff would not see me in my room at the Tavistock. They felt so intimidated and frightened because of this terrible tyrannical ideology that had taken over the service that did not allow people to question them, did not allow people to raise questions about whether the children were being sufficiently thought about. I'm particularly worried about children being started on a medical pathway after only a few meetings with no real attempt to try to understand. Trying to understand a child who's in great distress takes quite a while. You can't just do it in 6 meetings. The concern, so they came to see me in my consulting room because they were so scared. And subsequently, there was a kind of great attempt to find out who is it who spoke to David Bell. We want their names. Of course, we tried not to go along with that. So the concerns that they had were that these children were not the ordinary canons of clinical care, seemed to have been completely put aside when it came to these children. So often the ordinary ways of involving families, for example, whenever a child presents with disorder, the ordinary ways of finding out a lot about the history, the investigation of other problems that the child had, none of these were really happening. And the children were quite quickly being classed as transgender children. And at that time, although no one says this anymore, but at that time it was even said that children were in the wrong bodies. They were children in the wrong bodies. Mermaids subsequently gave that up. So I subsequently learned, mentioning mermaids, that mermaids and other trans lobbies had had a huge effect upon the GIDS service. And staff on the GIDS service were involved in these various lobbies. And they seemed to have, as I said, the consequence was, I mean, the CAS put this very well. She called it diagnostic overshadowing. That is, that these children, now, what the children, some of them have been very severely traumatized. I've heard of a child, for example, who's, I mean, there are many, many examples. A child whose a brother was run over and killed. And a year later, she says, I'm a boy. And the person who'd spoken to her, the clinician who'd spoken to this person, wanted to meet with the family because it's probably got something to do with giving the child back to these distraught parents for so bereaved. But that could not be investigated. That could not be thought about in the ordinary kind of way. There were children who were traumatized. There were children who'd been subject to emotional and physical abuse. There were children in which there was sexual abuse in the family. For instance, not that uncommon as a mother who's been abused in childhood and then sees her daughter develop secondary sexual characteristics and can't help it, conveys to the daughter that this is a terrible thing that's happening to her, and that the mother may even feel, consciously or not so consciously, that she can't bear to see this young girl with a sexual body. So that being put down. We know about 35% on the autistic spectrum, that there's very little attention paid to that. Then there were children who are depressed, suffering depression and anxiety, often for quite a while. And then there's quite a large group of children who are called children who are lost in the world. And they've been lost in the world for quite a long time. And now we're seeing all their lostness through this lens of transgender. The children, it was quite common, were scripted before they came to the interviews. So the trouble with the GIDS service, it wasn't a proper clinical service. It was seen as a gateway to puberty blockers. And once you set up a service as a gateway, then people will say, well, what is it I have to say in order to get through the gateway? And so children were scripted either online, but sometimes by parents who were very much on side, telling the child before, because I know this because colleagues overheard it, telling the children what to say, not in order to get the right help, but in order to get puberty blockers. As I said, many of them were very confused sexually, and that wasn't at all even looked at. So these staff, some of them themselves have become unable to sleep or quite disturbed by it. We're terribly worried about these children who are getting a kind of what I would call a double assault. The first assault was that all their problems were now being seen through this lens of being transgender. And second one, so they were put on a pathway, and the large number inappropriately, because it hadn't been properly thought about. And secondly, the problems that they had were not attended to. Now, Cass obviously has to be careful what she puts in that report, but you can see what she's saying is that this was negligent treatment of these children. She can't say use that word. But she said, why aren't these children getting the same care as children who are getting in ordinary CMHTs? So these children were doubly disadvantaged in that way. When the service started, the children who went on to puberty blockers, most came off them. Now, when I was, 98% of the children who went on puberty blockers stayed on them when you put opposite sex hormones. So it's and I think one of the reasons for this is that once you totally decide not to help the child with their terror of puberty, but support it, then you're saying to the child, puberty is a terrible thing. And the child, once they're on puberty blockers, never want to come off them. Why should they want to come off them? Unless there's going to be some kind of sustained help for them to manage puberty. So if it's right, it is right that that large number go on to opposite sex hormones, and then a large number go on to surgery, which has massive consequences. You know, perhaps we can go into that later. It's often talked of the top and bottom surgery. These people become patients for life as a result of these surgical procedures. So that means that putting children on puberty blockers is freighted with the knowledge, not just you're putting them on puberty blockers, but you're telling them your problems are gender problem. That's the way to think about them. And therefore you're putting them on a pathway. Now we don't know, because one of the shocking things about GIDS, they did not follow up the patients. This experimental treatment and no follow-up. This came out in some of the legal proceedings, which the judges expressed great alarm that GIDS couldn't answer questions about what happened to the children. How many went on to opposite sex hormones? How many went on to surgery? There was no follow-up. Subsequent to my meeting with the I wrote a report, and I submitted the report to the Council of Governors and to the board. And then there was an attempt by the tablet stock to silence me and to try to claim that I wasn't the right person to write such a report. Of course I was, because I was a staff representative. And they distorted various things that I said and other people had said, which eventually they had to retract. They tried to take disciplinary action against me, which failed, which didn't happen in the end. And my report, after my report was written, and they tried to stop me sending it to the governors, which I ignored, the trust set up a medical review, but the medical review was not a proper medical review. All it did was talk to members of GIDS. It didn't, a review, how many people come to the service, what percentage do you treat, what percentage go on to puberty blockers, what happens to them, all those ordinary things you do review a medical service. None of those happened. The review was a whitewash. A subsequent the press, to the Sunday Times, and then the whole thing became much more public knowledge. At the same time, there were a group of parents who were also complaining that made formal complaints to the trust, saying roughly the same things as I was saying, but particularly that they'd been marginalised. They hadn't been involved. Some of them, the first they knew was a letter to their child addressed to the child, instead of being listed now addressed as Miss, or vice versa. And that was again an odd thing, that we didn't involve the parents, and that was again mentioned in the proceedings. And then subsequent to that, as there's more and more public clamour, and also the axis started to shift. The atmosphere of tyranny started to die down a bit. It became possible at last for people to speak. More people working at GIDS began to speak, and other people who had been involved. And gradually it filtered through. We had some meetings at the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and eventually the outcome of that was the CAS review. And in brief, the CAS review totally supported all the things that I've written in my report that have led to this stopping puberty blockers, eventually the closing. I think that's what we do.
Thank you so much, David. Obviously, there's a big graph up there on the slides. I've heard some people say social contagion and social media has had a role to play in that huge exponential increase in the number of children being referred to GIDS. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course I can. I mean, the remarkable thing about that graph, there's two remarkable things. One is the exponential increase in referrals, and the huge increase in girls. You know, we could talk about why that is, but just to think of it as a social fact, that's an extraordinary phenomenon. And we had the coupling of that extraordinary phenomenon and a complete lack of interest in it. The Tavistock, which is famous for thinking of the individual in the family and in the society, no interest in finding out why has this increased so much, and why has it switched over? Why are there so many girls? Now, what you say about social contagion, I think I could answer that briefly by saying no psychological or psychiatric illness, and I mean no psychological or psychiatric, occurs independent of the culture in which it finds itself. So all psychological problems are an outcome of the internal situation in an individual and the culture in which they find themselves. For instance, hysteria, I mean, real hysteria, for example, by Freud and Charcot, there was quite an epidemic of hysteria, and it stopped not long after Freud came back from Paris. A few years later, it was much, much less. In Hong Kong, at one point, there was virtually no anorexia, none. And then a child appeared in a public place who was, you know, on the edge, died, subsequently died of anorexia. That was all over the newspapers. The following year, there were 10, there were 20, then there were hundreds. So, although the kinds of psychological problems that people may have may be rather continuous, the way in which they're represented depends. So the huge sudden focus on this, many girls, for example, have the thought, you know, they fancy a girl, very common to girls. Usually it's someone bigger and important. And they often have the thought, maybe, oh, that's not nice. Maybe I'm a boy. Of course, there was no culture to support that idea. But once there's this cultural transformation, then the cultural transformation affects the way the child expresses that problem and various other problems. And just like you can see in schools, for example, there'll be one and then there'll be a lot more. And you can see clusters in schools and not in other schools. So the person who did the main work on this is called Lippmann, who has written a number of excellent papers to show that social contagion is one of the most important vectors of this huge increase. And that is not surprising, given, you know, what I've said. I mean, I've heard some people say that social contagion isn't a factor. Well, that'd be very strange. You'd have to explain why social contagion wasn't a factor, given these sorts of figures.
Thank you.
Inviting me to come and speak to you today, and thank you to David for really giving me the background of the CAS review. So what I thought it might be useful to do was really just give you the tools to try and make sense of some of the responses that we've had to the CAS review. I can do, I can move a bit closer. Is that easy? Is that better?
Yes,
Yeah, okay. So, so I'm going to give you two pyramids that I want you to take away with you, because I'm not going to tell you what to think, but I'm going to tell you how to understand some of the criticisms and some of the responses you'll see to the CAS review. So the first pyramid is the evidence pyramid, and this is what we use in medicine to grade types of evidence, because there are lots of different types of evidence that we have that underpin all of our medical treatments. And this includes, well, any medical treatment will have evidence from different parts of this pyramid. And the bottom part of the pyramid is the least reliable evidence. And then as you go up the pyramid, you get better and better evidence. Normally, what we would expect is that the evidence at the bottom of the pyramid, everything's going in the same direction. So it's the evidence at the bottom of the pyramid is saying one thing, and then it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. But sometimes in medicine, what happens is that evidence at the bottom is at complete odds with the evidence at the top. And the evidence at the bottom of the pyramid is expert consensus. So this is what doctors generally think we should be doing for people. Now, you would hope that what doctors generally think we should be doing is right. They may not have all of the evidence to support it, but they're along the right tracks. But time and time again, if you look at the history of medicine, expert consensus is wrong. And it takes quite a lot. Once expert consensus has become the norm within a certain part of medicine, it takes an awful lot to shift that. And that's why we have this pyramid, really, to make sure that expert consensus is kept in check, because there's lots of cognitive biases, there's lots of interpersonal things that keep expert consensus as the thing that people go back to, even when the evidence doesn't support it. And one of the most, well, if we think about stomach ulcers, so probably in your lifetime, once upon a time, doctors were absolutely convinced that stomach ulcers were caused by stress and spicy food. And because of that, they really treated them with suppressing stomach acid. That was the treatment for stomach acid, for stomach ulcers. And that was the expert consensus. Everybody thought that. But then they realised that actually that's not what causes stomach ulcers. Actually, it's a bacterial thing. So the treatment for that completely changed. And now it completely revolutionised gastroenterology when we realised that. But for a long time, that consensus was there, and it stopped people seeing actually what was the case. More worrying is the case study of babies and clot death. So by 1970, there was clear evidence that placing babies on their front to go to sleep was a risk factor for clot death. There was evidence for that. But the expert consensus was that that's what you should do. And that expert consensus took 20 years to shift. And actually, it was because of a public campaign that it eventually shifted, that actually we need to put the babies on their back to sleep. If people had gone with the evidence and not expert consensus in 1970, we would have saved 50,000 infant deaths. So there is a reason why we don't just go with expert consensus. There's a reason we use this evidence pyramid in medicine, because it helps us overcome all of the biases that doctors have. These biases, and they're in all types of medicine, and we know they're there. So this evidence pyramid and then you get more evidence, controlled trial, and then right at the very top of the pyramid, you've got meta-analyses, which have got all of the data that's out there and synthesizes it. So that's what we're looking at when we really want to know what the evidence is for a treatment. One thing I would say about this, whenever anyone tries to change expert consensus, the first people that come forward and say, I don't think this is true, get really big pushback, really big, but they have to fight to really get that. And quite often they are seen as mavericks and out of touch with things, and the group will turn against them. And that's a kind of psychological thing that happens. So that happens again. If you look at the history of medicine, that happens time and time again. Just bear that in mind when I'm talking about some of the responses to the CAS review. So when we're thinking about where does the CAS review fit into that pyramid, what we're looking at is she's right at the very, very top of that pyramid. So what she's done is looked at literature reviews. She's looked at all of the quantitative research. She also tried to do her own research and get the data from the adult services who may or may not have followed up with the children that have been treated. She wasn't able to get that data. That data was withheld from her. She also talked to a lot of people who were trans-identified, both children and as adults as well. She looked at all of these stages of the evidence and pulled it all together. So this review, not many services will get this kind of review. I wish more did, but they don't. This is a really special thing that happened partly because of the background that David's given you. So this is right at the top of this pyramid. So whatever she comes up with really is the state of the art. This is what we know. So what did she conclude? These were her, this is her conclusion. I mean, it's a very long report it's nearly 400 pages, but this was the main conclusion. She said, whilst there's a considerable amount of research that's been published in this field, systematic reviews have demonstrated the poor quality of the published studies. So the studies that have been published are not good quality, and there's not a reliable evidence base upon which to make clinical decisions. So that evidence base that doctors were using was not reliable. There wasn't the data to support the expert consensus. And this was for the doctors and also for the children and their families. And there wasn't the evidence base to support. So if we're going to look at responses to that, I really want you to keep that conclusion in mind. So the conclusion that CAS came to is that there is not a good evidence base. So when we're looking at criticisms of CAS, we need to look at, okay, how are they counteracting that conclusion? The conclusions, there's not a good evidence base. What are you coming back to me with to say that there is? And you can look at critical responses, certainly on social media and certainly some activist groups. The response was absolutely immediate. They hadn't read the report. There's no chance for them to read the report. Their responses were absolutely immediate. And then you had individual clinicians coming out with their responses. You also had responses from the BMA. We also had responses from parliamentarians and parliamentary parties as well. And then there's also some peer-reviewed commentaries in the medical literature. So lots of different responses coming from lots of different groups. Some of them are just rejecting the conclusions. So they're just saying, I don't like the conclusions. Well, that's not really a criticism. That's just, I don't like it. There's not much you can do with that in terms of counteracting it. If you just don't like the conclusions, well, you're not really engaging with the process. And you saw this a lot on social media. And I think it's really important that people...
Yeah, I'm just reminding Dion to go on to the next slide.
Oh, I see. Thank you. So a lot of young people will go to social media when they want to find things out. That's where they get their opinions from. That's where they get their news from. And actually, if you look at a lot of the responses on social media, there's just no engagement with the review, really. So what happens is people just make stuff up to really make an acceptable version of events for themselves or their group. And then that would be repeated and reflected back until it became a well-known fact. And you could see this happening really within hours of the CAS review being published. So these things came up again and again in those first few days. So it was things like CAS ignored and rejected all of the positive research studies. So somehow she'd rejected all of that and she'd excluded up to 90% of the studies. She didn't include any trans people in the consultation. She was holding gender-affirming care to impossible and unrealistic standards, and she was insisting on a double-blind double-blind randomised controlled trials. So these things are out there and they're repeated and repeated as facts. None of these things are true at all. So this kind of response just represents somebody who hasn't engaged with review. So we've got people who don't like the conclusions, but we've also got people who don't agree with the conclusions. And these are the people that we need to be listening to, because nothing is infallible. So if there are criticisms, we need to be looking at them. We need to be engaging with them. So for people who don't agree with the conclusions, we need to be looking at that. And this is where the second pyramid really comes into play. So this is your hierarchies of disagreement. So if ever you're going to disagree with something that's really useful in politics, you need to be aware of this, because there are different levels of disagreement. You can start again right at the very bottom. You've got name calling. So this is the very lowest form of disagreement. You could insult someone without addressing the argument. And what you will see in this arena time and time again is, well, that's you're just a bigot. You're saying that because you're right-wing bigot. That's what we get time and time again. A little bit higher than that, and you've got the ad hominem attacks, and that's that you're saying that because you're extreme, you're right-wing, you're a transphobe. But again, not really engaging with the matter at all. A little bit higher up, you've got responding to tone, and we get a lot of this when you look at responses to the CAS review. So it's criticising the way that an argument has been presented, and this was one of the criticisms. The language used in the review implies a bias against transgender individuals, reinforcing harmful narratives. So not looking at, is there good evidence or isn't there? It's like, I don't like the way that you've said it. The other responding to tone that you will see time and time again is, well, it's in the Telegraph, or that was in the Times. So we're going to just discount that because of where it's been said. And then you get just flat contradiction. So you will get people just stating something completely opposite, but without backing it up. So again, in this arena, if people are looking at the CAS review, what you will see people say is puberty blockers are safe and fully reversible. We know that they've been used for decades. So they'll that will be the safe. They won't give you the evidence for that. And one of the really interesting, this is how I got into this field, was because I heard that puberty blockers were safe and fully reversible, and I work in brain development, and that blew my mind that that could be the case. So I went to look for that evidence because I wanted to know how would they establish that, because that's not what I would think working with people who, because I know a little bit about how the brain develops and the hormones. So I thought, that's incredible. Let's go and find that evidence. How did they establish that? There was nothing. There was no evidence to establish that. So there's just things that are thrown out there, and there's no evidence. This is where we do need to sit up and take notice. So if somebody is talking about a counter argument, so they're presenting an opposing argument, but not really addressing the original claim. So this is where you'll see, well, puberty blockers have been used for decades in people with central precocious puberty, very young children. So what's the problem with using it in trans people, young children with trans identified? And then you've got refutation. This is what we're really looking for. So finding a flaw in the other person's argument. So we want somebody, if you want to disagree with the CAS, you need to find a flaw in that report, and you need to explain why it's incorrect, and you need to use evidence for that. So what you would be looking for is somebody to say, the CAS report is based on outdated research, and here's a better example of the study that shows the opposite. So that's the sort of thing we would be looking for, and that would be a counterbalance. And then really what we want, if you're going to reject CAS, and I think you've got some motion here at the conference to talk about this, if you want to reject CAS, this is what you need. This is the highest level, the most effective argument against something. It directly addresses the core argument and it proves it wrong. So CAS's core central point was that the published studies in this arena are poor quality, meaning there is not a reliable evidence base on which to base clinical care. So if you want to address this and want to disagree with it, you need to produce the firm evidence base of high quality studies in which clinicians and patients and their families can make decisions. So this is some of the responses that we've had from clinicians who work in this field or clinicians who've got an interest. Remember, they are coming from the bottom. They're the expert consensus. And Cass challenges that expert consensus because she said, you know what, I think what you're doing is no evidence for it. So there's a challenge there. And this was published, I think, on the day that the Cass report came out. Bad news for our trans youth this morning, but let's be honest, we knew it was coming. Well, it's not bad news if somebody, one, has given this whole area a really thorough review. I mean, certainly it's bad news that there is no evidence base, but it gives you something to work with so that we can provide these patients with the correct care. And then they go on to say that over the coming days, I and many other clinicians will be taking a look at the CAS review and trying to answer why she was unable to find the research needed to provide transuse with vital approaches that the other countries found. But the reason that the other countries found it is because they produced expert consensus reports. So they are looking at evidence right at the bottom of the pyramid, whereas CAS's evidence is right at the top. That's fine. And then this is a more recent criticism, again from a psychologist working in this field. The bias and flawed CAS review is not respectful of trans youth. Well, that's just name calling, and that's criticising tone. There are multiple critiques from within the trans community. That might be the case, but that's people who just don't like the conclusions. Other countries have completed much more in-depth reviews and come to very different conclusions. No, they haven't. CAS is the most comprehensive thing that we have. And then just name calling, beware of transphobic gender critical issues. So this person really just took the evidence from the bottom of that pyramid and put it at the top of the pyramid. Okay, so in the medical literature, there are also some published and unpublished critiques of the CAS review. And again, if you don't want to go through all of the arguments in these papers, what you can do is put it into ChatGPT and say, pull out the arguments, create a bar chart of what level of disagreement each argument is, and it'll give you a bar chart and it'll show you graphically what each one of these critiques is. Very, very, very useful. And then you can say, give me examples. It'll give you examples. You need to check it. So you need to check it, but it's quite useful just to see where are they coming from. And then these are criticisms of the critiques. So these papers have really just gone through those critiques that have been published of the CAS review and looked to say, well, actually that's just not true. So there's a lot, surprisingly actually, in the published peer-reviewed literature, people have just said things that just aren't true, that haven't been picked up by the peer reviewers. So, and that is a problem in this field, that things get through that just aren't true. So some of the things are just not true. A lot of the arguments are just coming from those bottom levels of disagreement. None of the criticisms of CAS have come up with anything from the top of that pyramid, like here's the review. And I'm just going to finish with just a couple of things. I said I'm going to leave it up to you to make sense of what you read. Okay, and I am, but I'm just going to look at these two things. So one of the things you will see time and time again on social media is that the review holds gender medicine to a higher standard than other paediatric medicine, and that she's requiring a randomised controlled trial. And because there isn't a double-blind one, well, of course there can't be a double-blind one, then that's just not fair. It's being held to an unrealistic standard. That's not true. So the very low quality of evidence in gender medicine doesn't stem from the lack of a randomised controlled trial. There's lots of things that you can't randomise. You can't randomise brain surgery. You know, if you have brain surgery, there's all sorts of things you can't randomise. But it comes from poor study design and inappropriate comparison groups and really high attrition rates. David was saying we don't know what happens to a lot of these people, and really inadequate follow-up. And in my case, my field, just non-existent studies. Nobody's looked at it. They say it's completely reversible, but nobody's looked. You can't say something's reversible if you haven't checked. And then this is the second one. The recommendations of the category review are transphobic and discriminatory because children with central precocious puberty are prescribed puberty blockers and no one worries about the harmful impacts on them. So you'll hear that a lot. Well, one, we do worry about the harmful impacts on them because this is a medical intervention. But puberty blockers are used to treat an abnormal physiological process in children with central precocious puberty. They're used to stop 5-year-old girls developing breasts and periods. In children with gender identity difficulties, they're used to stop, prevent a normal developmental process. It's a completely different use of the drug, completely different. And medical treatments are based on your medical condition. They're not based on your identity. It's not diabetic phobic that I can't get insulin because I'm not diabetic. It's because I don't have diabetes. So whether or not you get a treatment is based on the condition that you have, not your identity. And that's really, really important. Okay, so if we're looking for a firm evidence base, remember that that was her central conclusion. There is no firm evidence base. All of the critiques, all of the responses that you will see on social media from clinicians, from people working in the field, right the way up to published papers, not one has refuted the central point that there is an evidence base, and here it is. So all we have is expert consensus. And that's just not good enough for these children. They deserve the best. And then CAS is the first step towards that.
I mentioned at the beginning that you did a review into the cognitive impacts of puberty blockers. Would you be kind enough to share what the result of that review was, and would you talk us through actually getting that review published in the first place?
Yeah, so again, as I said earlier, the reason I started looking at this is because when I heard they were fully reversible and it didn't have a long-term impact, that didn't fit with anything I understood about the brain. So I wanted to see this research. I didn't come at it thinking that can't possibly be true. It's just like, my goodness, I wonder how they found that, because that doesn't fit in with my view of the brain. So that's why I went to look at this. That's kind of my interest came from a neurological perspective. And then when I looked, there was nobody had looked. And absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And that was the key thing, really. And I just wanted to put that out there as a review. So I looked at the animal literature, I looked at the literature in precocious puberty, and then I looked for some evidence in children with gender identity problems. I wrote the paper, I tried to get it published. It did get published in the end, but it's absolutely okay for journals to reject something. So I'm not complaining that journals reject the paper. I've published hundreds of papers, and I know the process. I know how it works. What was absolutely unique about this paper compared to all of the others that I published was the reasons that it was given for being rejected. So one of the reasons was it might stigmatise an already stigmatised group. Well, that's not a good reason for not getting it out there that there is no evidence for what people are saying. That's not a scientific reason for rejecting. And I think I'd use males and females as terms throughout. And there's, clearly this is biased because you're using sex-based language. Well, you need to talk about sex-based language if you're going to talk about brain development. That's kind of part of it. So there were all sorts of. It's not that they were rejected, it's why they were rejected. That was an absolute eye-opener for me, because as I say, I'm very lots of experience publishing things, I've got lots of experience reviewing things, but the reasons for keeping it out of public knowledge were this is going to damage them. They were ideological, this is going to damage the group, when actually it's not going to damage them. But if you don't let people know, this group will continue to be underserved in the medical community.
Very much so.
LGBT Alliance is the only charity that exclusively supports same-sex attracted people in the UK. So that's lesbians, gay men and bisexuals. And we've long said that the vast majority of young people who find themselves at a gender clinic are those who are either coming to terms with the idea or beginning to struggle with the idea that they might be attracted to somebody of the same sex. And the CAS review confirmed exactly what we knew. Now, just before I show you my next slide, it's got some numbers on it, and I'm not a statistician and I don't know anything much about data, but I really don't think you need to know much to look at slides like this. If I could have the next slide, please. So this shows that within the general population, broadly speaking, between 2 and 3% of people are probably lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Might be a bit more, might be a bit less, but that's kind of the ballpark. We can have a look at the next slide. Now this is how many of the young people at GIDS were lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And we can break it down a bit more. So 89% of the girls were lesbian or bi, and of the boys, 81% were gay or bi. Now these figures were collected in 2016, at which point they stopped collecting data about sexual orientation. Now I don't know if, I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but we do know that the staff noticed, and we do know that lots of the staff felt really, really uneasy about what was happening, and the dark joke apparently that was doing the round, going up and down the corridors of the Tavistock, which was soon there would be no more gay kids left. So they were really aware that these were gay young people being treated. And I think a question that we would ask is, how could a clinician look around and not say, like, why is my waiting room full of gay young people? And even worse, maybe they look around and they notice and they think, oh, well, I'll carry on regardless anyway. So, it's shocking and horrifying. Grab the next one, thank you. So the next question that we'd really want to untangle is, why are LGBT people so susceptible? Why are they do they seem to Well, one of the things is that proponents of gender identity ideology, what they might take to be, and they would call it evidence that a child is born in the wrong body, or that they're a trans child, which is a construct, I don't believe it exists, but they say this person was a trans child, really, really overlaps with kind of behaviours that are fairly good indicators that a child may grow up to be lesbian or gay. Not always, but sometimes it can be an indication. And you'll be unsurprised to hear, in my line of work, I do meet lots of lesbians and gay men, and they will tell you, lots of adult lesbians will say, God, I hated wearing dresses. I once wanted to climb trees. I played football. I wanted short hair, and I played with the boys. And lots of adult gay men will say, I just wanted to do my dance things with my sister and, and play with dolls. And doesn't mean all those children are going to grow up to be lesbian or gay. But, it's a bit of an indication. But the gender ideologists have taken this as evidence, as proof that something's gone wrong. I mean, it really does seem absurd, but they might look at something and say, if a boy likes pink, then he's got a girl brain, and if a girl likes short hair, then she's really got a boy brain. It seems absurd because it is absurd, but that's what they'll say. I think it's quite interesting to note that there are words for girls that are quite kind of admiring. So you'd say a parent might see a girl climbing a tree or playing football, and she'll say, oh, she's quite a tomboy. Roll their eyes a little bit, but it's a little bit admiring. And that's because in our society, it's preferable to be all things male than it is to be female. Because there's no equivalent word for boys. If your boy is a bit girlish or your boy is a bit of a sissy, there's a kind of a shame and a little bit of a stigma attached to that. And it's completely speculation, but I do sometimes wonder whether the huge numbers of girls who are transitioning are shifted along a little bit by the fact there might be a little bit less parental resistance to the idea of a girl becoming a boy than a boy becoming a girl. That's entirely speculative and based on nothing I have to say. But we do know that the Tavistock only saw handfuls of children for many years who had gender dysphoria, and most of those children were boys. But then following the explosion of gender identity ideology, and you saw the earlier chart, you know, that completely flipped about, and it's overwhelmingly girls. And what I think we see is a conflation of people's kind of burgeoning idea of their sexual orientation, of who they're attracted to, with a distress about one's body or one's gender identity. And you might say, well, do you know what, so what? Hasn't it always been the case that teenagers, that's the time when you like to rebel and you start to feel differently? It's when you discover who you are and you might rebel. You know, maybe this is just this modern iteration of something that we've seen in teenage lives for generations. And it's true, a kid might say, am I trans or am I gay? But crucially, only one of those outcomes requires doctors and surgeons to make it happen. And only one requires that you become a medical patient for life. And only one comes with absolutely dire physical and emotional and physiological consequences if you later change your mind. And we know lots of people do change their minds. 85% roughly, if you may correct me, but in the high 80s, children grow out of gender dysphoria, and that's because children change their minds a lot. So I don't think that's much of a surprise to people. Now, Dr. Cass described the evidence base for the benefits of giving children puberty blockers as remarkably weak, and we just think, you know, on that basis, it's extraordinarily cruel to tell a child who very likely to be struggling with feeling that they might be attracted to someone of the same sex, to tell them that their body is wrong, that it is broken, that somehow they are ill and they need to be treated or fixed with drugs or surgery. It's not kind at all. It is extraordinarily cruel to children to do that to them. And I think this is being inflicted on gay young people in the main. LGBT adolescents do feel very different to their peers, and it can be hugely uncomfortable. Lots of adolescents feel uncomfortable. If you're given the choice of being the slightly weird, geeky, awkward kid who's unhappy with their body and they're possibly not very popular, or you can be the complete toast of the school, and the teachers and your parents and everybody else is forced to celebrate you and reward you for being so precious and special. It's really just easy to see why kids who are vulnerable, and lots of kids are vulnerable, are really drawn towards that as an idea. And I think that's what we're seeing. So the Cass review says, in terms of narratives and case histories, the review received several reports from parents of birth-registered females that their child had been through a period of trans identification before recognising that they were cisgender, same-sex attracted. And that's really very much supported by the emails that, you know, as a charity that we receive from parents. And mind pushing one up. So here's one. It's quite typical. I'll read it out just for this one. My daughter, 14, is in desperate need of counselling. She's lesbian, her words and declaration, not mine. She suffers the most awful homophobic bullying at school, is regularly called faggot, and has children who make noises like ooh every time she walks past them. Occasionally it's mildly physical, and the school bus is like the Wild West. Wouldn't mind doing the next slide. And the next one says, my daughter is, I believe, thinking about transitioning. I think she currently believes she's gender neutral. I find the whole concept of declaring yourself gender neutral because you have short hair and like to wear trousers incredibly sexist. I've tried to explain this, but I'm aware she may just think I'm being old-fashioned and perhaps transphobic. She needs role models of teens like herself, who are either lesbian or bi, who are proud of being an androgynous butch young woman. Thanks so much if you can help. So what we see here from those two examples is that it's deeply unfashionable to be a lesbian, but it's really cool to be trans. And it's a kind of a push and a pull at play there. So there's a push away from being gay, being a lesbian, and you see that in the first note where the kids are like, oh, you know, that's disgusting. It's kind of a homophobia. That's a bit away from it. And then there's a pull towards it where the parents are indicating that it feels like I'll be allowed to have short hair. I'd be allowed to wear trousers. I would be allowed really to run away from the elements of femininity that maybe I find so difficult to handle. So the kids are faced with this sort of push and pull all the time from their peers and from all of the adults around them, from the adults that they trust, from their family members and friends. And I think for many, it's really, really overwhelming. And we've received lots of letters in a similar vein. And the usual trajectory is a parent will say, my daughter's 14, 15, she told me she was a lesbian. We were kind of fine with that. She told her friends at school, had a really negative reaction, goes back and says, well, actually, she's non-binary. That's not quite enough. So now she wants binders and puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones because she's decided that she's trans. So we see that all the time. So that's why some parents who really believe that their children's transition might only be a kind of a social transition. Maybe that's not so bad. You know, a boy might say, well, I want to change my name to a girl's name and I want to wear a school skirt instead of school trousers. But the Cass Review does also caution against social transition because it isn't a neutral act. And I can give you another example. We run a helpline for young people. And we had a contact not very long ago, and it was from a girl who told us that she persuaded her parents that she wanted to be a boy, and they were really affirming and they were really supportive. So she changed her name, and they thought it would be better if she went to a new school because then all the new kids would know that she was a boy and she would present as a boy. Whether or not these kids believed it or not, they all went along with that. She just registered for her GCSEs with her boy's name. And her awful dilemma, of course, and the reason she got in touch with us was that she changed her mind and she just didn't know what to do. Like I don't think we can underestimate this mortification and the embarrassment and the shame, which is, you know, something which really matters a lot to teenagers, of having made this decision and feeling that they've got no way out of it. You know, it really is a big deal. And social transition is also really bad for the rest of the school, because if you've got a school of 1,000 kids and one of them wants to be, you know, recognised as identified as being the opposite sex, it means you've got 999 other kids who have to collude in that lie in order to make that true for that first child, and that's not a great message for schools. So we were really pleased that the Cass Review clearly recognises and highlights the difference between gender identity, which is a feeling and an idea which may be held inside your head, and sexual orientation, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual or bisexual, which is real. And it's really important to make the distinction between those two. So we were really delighted that the previous Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, banned the prescribing of puberty blockers to children. And also we were especially pleased that she moved to stop some of these really pernicious online providers who will send children, you know, prescriptions without even having, you know, properly seen them. So she was able to crack down on those as well. And we're really pleased too that Wes Streeting's been really steadfast in his commitment to implement Cass in full. So the problem that we see on the horizon is that some children who are unable to get puberty blockers which they've been told is life-saving healthcare, are jumping straight to cross-sex hormones. Now, these drugs they are more powerful, they're more dangerous, and more of the effects are irreversible. So I would just like to finish with a recommendation from CAS, which seems to have received a bit less attention, but which is of vital importance to lesbian, gay and bisexual children. I had that last slide. Is that up? Great. And that is that NHS England should review the policy on masculinising and feminising hormones. The option to provide hormones from age 16 is available, but the review would recommend extreme caution. There should be a clear clinical rationale for providing hormones at this stage, rather than waiting until an individual reaches 18. LGB Alliance endorsed this, and we stand with CAS in saying that cross-sex hormones should not ordinarily be prescribed to children under 18. Thank you.
Be really quick. I'm sure there's lots of questions in the audience. So, hey, I have a quick question for you, and then David wants to make a couple of points. So I noticed that among detransitioners, there's quite a number of LGB who decide the reason they want to detransition is that they've since realised then that they are same-sex attracted. But what kind of support do you think we need to be offering these detransitioners who may have irreversibly changed their bodies?
I think something to think about is that when you transition, you join a community of people who are delighted for you. You immediately, especially if you start off as a bit of a vulnerable person and you join this community of people who are rooting for you and you really feel a part of it, to then detransition, I think one of the dangers is that we, as gender critical people, kind of grab those detransitioners and what happened to them when they were celebrated and lauded when they transitioned. I think there's a danger that we do that a bit to them when they detransition. And actually, these are very vulnerable people who probably need a bit more support just to get on with ordinary life. So I know this talk of a detransition unit that Wes Streeting talked about, but I haven't seen any signs of it, and I don't know what that will comprise, but there definitely needs to be more specialist support, because surely the numbers are going to grow.
Thanks for allowing me just to make a couple of points that occurred to me while the other speakers were speaking, and I'll be quite brief because I know people want to speak. But the first thing is about reversibility. When I was bringing this to attention, the chief executive of our trust said that puberty blockers were reversible. What he meant by that was if you stop them, puberty happens. But the important thing, and I think this is about what Sallie was saying, is that the body isn't a video recorder. That is, at a certain point in time, the body, the psychology, and the social world in which a child is living is ready for puberty. So if you stop it and then start it 3 years later, that isn't reversibility from any of those perspectives, apart from the long-term consequences on bone mineralization and cognition. The second point I wanted to make was I was reminded of when I went to a conference, mainly about all the people speaking were were lesbian non-conforming women who'd been misunderstood. And one of them, when they spoke, the first one that spoke said, "I speak for a generation of children who've been deprived of the capacity to have an imagination." I thought it was an extraordinary comment. In order to be free to think, am I a boy, am I a girl? Instead, to be overwhelmed by the affirmation ideology. The second thing is a clinical point, which I didn't make and I wanted to make, is when people use the term gender affirming, it's absolutely not a clinician's role to affirm anything. A clinician has a neutral role. If someone comes to me and says, "I really hate my wife, I decided to get divorced," I don't say, "Well, it's good on you." let's help you get divorced. I don't know what this person called wife is. I don't know what husband is, and I don't know what marriage is, and I don't know what divorce is. So I'm neutral, but I want to understand how you've come to this, what it means to you. And if someone, I was speaking to someone from LGBT Alliance actually, and said to me, if someone from next door came to me and said, I think I'm gay, say a 14-year-old boy, he would say, oh, that's great. He'd say, well, I wonder what that means to you and how that's going to evolve and so on. Affirmation is a kind of capture, and it's totally against. We don't say to an anorexic girl, we agree with you that you should be 6 stone. We have a neutral and we explore. So the invasion of the clinical space by this affirming is a totally going against what the role of a clinician is. And the last thing is to say, it's partly to do with what you were saying. I've sometimes said in talks that, we've progressed a lot in the way we think about gender identity. In fact, I've been corrected on that. Someone said you may have in North London, but not elsewhere. What I meant was that when many years ago, if I sat on a committee appointing someone, and a woman of mine with short hair and boots and trousers, people might have commented about it. No one would comment. Not because they think it's wrong. It wouldn't even occur to them to comment. And it wouldn't even occur to them to be bothered about who this person sleeps with. It's not our business. So we have accepted that gender can be expressed in many, many different ways. And in many of our communities, we celebrate that. But in the ideological movement, there's been a regression. If a girl doesn't play with toys and so on, maybe she's a boy. So that's a regression to a binary way of thinking, which I think is culturally, socially, and psychologically extremely damaging.
Thank you, David. Okay, we're going to go around with microphones now so that lots of people can get a chance to ask questions. What I'm going to do is ask the questioner to say which of the panel members they'd like to answer the question, because if all three answer each question, we won't get through many questions, if that's okay. All right, so Imogen, do you want to start to hands up, please, those who've got a question?
Brilliant. My question's in your role.
Could you just hold it a bit closer?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So in your role, what I'm really interested in is we're all here, we're at a party conference. There's lots of MPs. I don't think there's any MPs here. And I see MPs as being in leadership roles. And I see the newspapers, and I found this 5 years or so ago, but before I found it, I didn't understand what it was all about. With your psychiatrist, psychologist hat on, what's going on? Because the behaviour I see from sort of people that just stick their heads in the sand, or
People who
dig their heads in the sand.
Oh, yeah.
But when there's lots of evidence, I think that's what I'm coming back to. There's all this evidence about it. And for me, I find it quite upsetting because it feels so strong. It's not like a silly issue like, the verges or I don't know, it's a serious issue with children and health. And I don't understand, and I just wanted to put the psychiatrist, psychologist hat on. What's going on? Why don't people question? Where's the curiosity? I genuinely don't understand it.
Well, that's a very good question. In terms of the sort of micro community of the Tavistock, there was a sense amongst many colleagues this was wrong, but there was a kind of best not to go there. We've not, our budget is a bit under threat this year, and the trust, is very committed to this. In fact, it occupied a very significant part of the income of the trust because it was a national service and therefore nationally funded. They didn't have to go to commission. So there's a sense of keeping your nose clean. But I think more, certainly in the early years, there was terror. That people were actually very, very frightened to speak up. I was an older clinician. I had my pension and things like that. And people were very, very worried. And I think it's the same at universities that people veg. But there's I think there's two main elements, and a very large one is a not wanting to do anything, coupled with ignorance. Ignorance is different from conspiracy. So that people who haven't gone into it probably thought, well, I ought to look at that, but I'll do it another time. And maybe they're trying to put another bill through, so they don't want to get involved in that and cause a lot of trouble. And have a sense of just not wanting to go there and think, well, I'm a liberal person. I've been liberal with a small L, and people are telling me this is all part of a change in society which I should celebrate, and people having freedom. So all that sounds good to me. That satisfies a sort of less conscious wish to not get involved. I do think, if you think, when I started out, I mean, people would characterize me, I suppose, as far left Labour. And it was very difficult because a lot of my bedfellows, so to speak, were the Telegraph, the Times, and Conservative MPs and Lords. And they were not, the large majority of them, upset because of family values or something. They were concerned about what's happening to children. And it took a long time because the trans lobby seemed to be very, very effective in, so when we say a movement is captured, what do we really mean by that? It means that individuals will be very effective in getting themselves into high positions and having becoming influencers. And those influencers, have a huge effect. And some people are very frightened about being called transphobe, being told that they're being discriminated and so on. So I think there's lots of reasons, cultural and personal, that go together. And but I think it's changing. At least it's changing. It's changed in the Labour Party. I hope it's going to change in your party.
Next question, please.
I'm afraid I don't have a question, but I don't think I'd blame it all on children being mixed up. I think society is very mixed up as it is.
So I can't hear you. Could you decide?
I don't think it's fair to be saying it's all children who are confused. I find society, I feel I have an intelligent head on me. I've never come across a point of society where there's so much confusion about one issue. I just don't know if everybody agrees, but it just seems that there's something amiss in society. It's amiss in the conversations. It's amiss in the understandings. A lot of this has got quite, very far apart. And so I think there's a very deep confusion in society.
So who would like to take that question?
It might feel confusing, but really I think it's very simple. And I think I think activists try to make it confusing, and it's a smokescreen behind which they are able to capture organisations. I think it's really, really simple. There's no such thing as a trans child. There's only two sexes. Sex is binary and immutable.
David, I've noticed you don't use the term of trans child either anymore. Could you tell us from a clinical perspective why that is?
Yeah, I wouldn't quite say myself, there's no such thing as a trans child. It's just that's not the way I would put it. But it's the same kind of, I put it a slightly different way. And in one of his plays, someone says something like, I've got pain in my joint, but I know what it is now. The doctor said I've got arthralgia, which of course just means pain in the joint. So doctors are very, very good at inventing clever Greek-sounding terms, which are merely redescriptions. So I don't know what gender I'm in a lot of pain. You've got gender dysphoria. We can put it doesn't really tell you anything. So I talk about children who are distressed, and the way that the distress is presenting itself is through painful confusion about their gender and sexual identity. I think that's a much better. And then I want to know how they came there, where it came from, what its history is. And it covers a multitude of different things. Some children, confused about their sexuality. Some children identified with the opposite sex for different reasons in relation to perhaps some of them I mentioned, like abuse in the family, great difficulties in coming to terms with femininity for various complicated reasons. Then there's another group, well, there are many other groups, it doesn't really matter. So saying it's a transgender child doesn't really tell you anything. Second of all, by using that term, you sound as if you've made a diagnosis. And you haven't. All you've done is affirm what the child said. I'm transgender, you're transgender, that's not a diagnosis. And then everything, as Cass so well put it, I said in my report that everything was now seen through the lens of being trans. So Cass put it that she called it diagnostic overshadowing. So once you make that, then there's a tendency to think everything can be explained by this, and then very dangerously, the child may be led to believe that by embarking on a pathway, they will solve their problems, which they won't. And the last thing, the word that hasn't been used so far is the word experiment. This has been an experiment on children. And it's an experiment. You may say there's no evidence, but if some people say it's helpful, why shouldn't they have it? But it's been an experiment, and it's an experiment that's failed. And I'm trying to do all I can to prevent there being a puberty blockers trial. And that is just another experiment giving children medication which we know is harmful.
Any questions from the back? Yeah, yeah.
Hello, I think it's probably a question for Sally or possibly David. I am really concerned at the idea that a randomized controlled prospective trial is going to be approved. I cannot understand how ethical approval will be gained for this. And I'd like to know why this experiment has been carried out on these children. I can't understand why somehow we cannot look at the results and the effects on these children and do it that way. The thought of giving them the blue pill or the red pill, I think, is quite scary.
I couldn't agree with you more. The trial makes no sense either ethically or even methodologically. The trial is to last for 2 years, I think. Might be wrong, but it's quite a short time. Children who are on puberty blockers will, of course, not go through puberty. So on probably many scales, they'll say, I feel better. And children who are not on puberty blockers will know they're not on puberty blockers, and they're going to say they feel worse. That doesn't really tell you anything. Secondly, we're in any group of children, if we say it's a group of 100 children, we say it's group A and group B. Group A will persist so that when they're 18, 19, 20, they still feel that they're, want to change their gender. And group B will desist. Well, we have pretty good knowledge that group B is much, much bigger than group A. Much bigger. And we also know that we have absolutely no way of telling whether any individual child belongs to group A or group B. So that means if you give the puberty blocker to a group of children, you'll be harming a great number of children who, if handled in a different way, would have desisted. Secondly, you're prescribing a drug to them, which we know, well, we don't know, there's very good evidence to say it's harmful. So if you were a parent and your child was going to be put on the trial, you were told, well, we don't have fantastic evidence, but we have quite a lot of evidence about problems in bone mineralization and quite a lot of animal studies that say if you go on puberty blockers, it causes the cognitive deficiencies. You wouldn't just say, oh, well, that wasn't animal studies. Okay, I don't want my child to go on that. So I don't know how parents are going to agree to this. And I don't know how we're going to find children who have only got gender distress. All these children have multiple other problems. So are there other problems going to be treated? But the bottom line is, you could do, as you absolutely rightly call it, a naturalistic study. That is, spend the next 10 years following up those thousands of children who went through GIDS and see what happened to them. And that way, the adult clinics have tried to stop researchers getting hold of the data, because a lot of those children were transferred to adult clinics at the age of 70. The large number of children go to adult clinics, and of adults who go to adult clinics, about 30–40% of what we would call adolescents. So those people need to be followed up, and we could find a lot of information. Personally, and I really, really don't know this, I think it's some kind of odd political compromise. But we're subjecting children to this harmful treatment for political reasons. That's what.
Thanks, David. Any more questions? Hello, yes, an online question. We've got quite a few people coming in from Zoom link. Can our neurobiologist give us evidence to nail shut the coffin on the claim, I have a woman's brain in a man's body?
That's a really interesting question. And again, if you look at the science, some people have looked at lots of different measures of female brains and male brains, and they've tried to kind of, they've kind of used AI and said, these are all female brains, these are all male brains, I'm going to give you a brain, can you guess if it's a male brain, female brain? And AI is not bad actually at guessing, but there are lots of reasons for that. And one of those reasons is because male brains and female brains run on different fuel. So female brains have a different kind of hormonal mix than male brains. Male brains have obviously got more testosterone. The brain's got loads and loads of different sex receptors, and they pick those up. So right from the very beginning, the fuel that you've been running on is going to shape how your brain looks. But there is no such thing as a female brain or a male brain. It's a bit like saying is a female height or male height. Roughly, men are taller than women, but if I give you somebody who's 6 foot tall, I can't definitively say that is a man. It might be more likely, could be less likely. So you are your brain, basically. Your brain is attached to your body. It is all part of the same thing. So if it's in your body, that's the brain that you've got. So yeah, I would say you will see studies saying, you know, this is a female brain, this is a male brain. It's shaped by experience, it's shaped by the fuel that it's run on. And the other interesting thing about some of the brain research is that they don't take into account sexuality and your sexual orientation. And there are some changes in their sexual orientation.
Thank you very much, Mark Johnston. Thank you very much for all of the contributions tonight. Policy is one thing, but politics is another. And this is a political party, and tomorrow morning in the big hall next door, we will vote on a policy on this, which is prepared by the leadership, prepared by a experienced MP. So, question in two parts. The first part is a closed one, and perhaps speaks for itself, but it's to say, to ask, is this a health issue or is this a rights issue? And is this party right tomorrow morning to frame this as a rights issue or otherwise? And secondly, you know, what are the political prospects going forward, given all of the policy changes that have happened in the real world? And we could pick any day, but let's say 2017, I think, when David's whistleblower report was available. I apologise if that's not quite accurate. But so what's happened in the last 7-8 years of policy changes? Two big political parties dropping the trans agenda, more or less. To what extent, if at all, is this party being realistic in voting for business as usual? Thank you.
I say this is a health issue, and it's a rights issue because everybody has the right to evidence-based health, and that's where it comes from. There is nothing different about trans care or cardiology. Everybody deserves the right to have the best medical care and to have doctors doing something that they know there is an evidence base for. So that's where the rights come in, but it's health. And it's interesting that it's, because people say, you know, well, why is Parliament saying that they're blocking beauty blockers? What's it got to do with Parliament to block a medical treatment? Well, the reason that Parliament got involved is because the doctors were not doing their job. That, I mean, David described how this kind of treatment just ran away without anybody really checking. And that's when politics got involved. But this should have never have got to a political issue. This should have been sorted at a medical level. And unfortunately, it took kind of David's report and subsequent events and CAS for that to happen. But it's a health issue.
Would anyone else like to comment on the political situation?
I mean, I think if, as we see women's rights and LGBT rights being deprioritised, I think it's something that the parties aren't going to be able to ignore, even if they wanted to. And it's often framed about, you know, the trans agenda, but it really isn't. It's often about women's rights and LGBT rights. And so I think sometimes it can take the heat off a little bit if you look at it from that angle. But I just don't think it can be ignored.
Okay, thank you. We can wrap up shortly unless anyone else has any further questions. And then you can feel free to approach afterwards if we don't get kicked out. Okay, Nicole?
Thank you. I'm not sure exactly who to ask this to, so I'm just interested in your views on what you think MPs or the education sector or who about the teaching that's going on in schools. And I say this as a mother who's been fighting for 6 months now to try and get the PSHE material from her school, and then had her daughter, 12-year-old, taught it. And she was told that there's more than 2 sexes, that it's not a phase, it's not a mental health illness, it's not dressing up and pretending to be the opposite sex. You know, all these things. And I just want to know what, from government, what we should be hearing to actually stop this, because I can't stop it in her school.
The previous, the Conservative government actually produced a document on the teaching of gender sexuality in school, a good document actually, and but it was they had no method, it seems to me, of enforcing it. So things were carrying on as usual. There were schools in which mermaids were going in and taking control of the teaching of gender sexuality to children, and exactly as I was saying, very young children were being asked what pronoun to use, what gender they were. And if we're going to really help children, the schools are their prime location. It's not the health service, it's in the schools. As we were talking about before with social contagion, it's school where, and in quite a lot of schools, the teachers are ignorant. That is, they're not really good, but they just haven't looked into it, they don't know. So we need to do a lot of education of teachers. But more than anything, the Department of Education has to have the you can't have one part of government saying one thing and business as usual elsewhere. So there has to be a way of re-examining education in school and ensuring that children aren't drawn into this, because that is very, very dangerous. That will keep the epidemic up. If things are toned down in schools, gradually I think the numbers will decrease. So they are the main location. And it's absolutely, I've been to a few schools, and maybe I met teachers who, once I spoke to them, understood. They just thought, oh, well, this seems to be the right thing. And maybe Mermaids or one of the other organisations come in and told them that this is, if they didn't do this, they were harming the child. So they need support, and for many of them, was their common sense, which has deserted them. But I absolutely agree with it, and I agree with what was said before about this. It is extraordinary, isn't it, to have a political party vote on whether to accept the findings of the most extensive, thoroughgoing and broad review of gender care in children that's taken place anywhere in the world. It is not their role to decide whether to accept that. That is a health and medical issue.
I can see people outside the room. Looks like they want to come up. So I'm going to call it a day there. If you could just thank our panel again. Nice got some leaflets at the back, with a brief description of what we think is, wrong in F9, which we'll vote on tomorrow, so if you'd like to take them on your way out. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yes.